So let's continue this discussion about Keynesian open economy macro policies. And we're going, in this instance, to be talking about fixed exchange rates. So the central bank pegs the exchange rate, and the central government is considering fiscal stimulus as a way to increase domestic economic activity. So we're using aggregate demand policies through tax cuts or government spending increases to change the trajectory of GDP growth. Okay, and we're doing this in a kind of ISLM model, fixed prices and wages, a short-run Keynesian story with a small country in international financial markets. So a tax cut or government spending increase in this framework really has very similar effects. They both increase the demand on goods and services, either by putting more income, not more money, say more income, in the hands of consumers that they can spend on goods and services, or the government directly spends on infrastructure or some such thing. As we've seen in an earlier video, that a tax cut or government spending increase will indeed tend to increase aggregate demand, increasing GNP, and increasing interest rates. The increased interest rates you can think of in a number of ways. One way is through the government spending increase. So imagine that the government it finances the government spending increase through deficits. It doesn't, so the government goes out into the bond market to raise money. So they sell bonds and borrow funds from the general public. That increased supply of bonds tends to push down the price of bonds, and interest rates tend to rise. Tax cut will increase the demand for money as well, tending to raise interest rates. So both of these policies raise interest rates. Now I want you to compare that to another video where we talk about monetary policy, because this interest rates tend to fall with that policy. So here's the critical difference. So GNP will have an impact on this initial increase in GNP will have an impact on the current account balance. Increase in economic activity means buying more goods and services, some of which are imported. So the current account balance tends to go into deficit. So you have an increase in the imports of goods and services. The increase in the interest rate tends to cause our bonds to be more attractive to foreigners. If you go back and you look at the videos about interest rate arbitrage, this is where those relationships come into play. The higher interest rates means there'll be more demand for domestic bonds by foreigners. So essentially what we do is export our bonds because they have become more attractive. Now, the next step of this is trying to look at whether there's pressure for depreciation or appreciation. And for that, we need to look at whether or not there's a balance of payments, surplus, or deficit. Current account tending to go into deficit, private capital account tending to be in surplus. Well, which one is a bigger effect? This is where we are going to use sort of an extreme assumption of perfect capital mobility across borders. What do I mean by that? There are no restrictions whatsoever in foreigners being able to buy domestic bonds or vice versa. When we have this high degree of capital mobility, which is really pretty close to what occurs in many countries currently, the pressures on the exchange rate are going to occur right here in the private capital account. So let me repeat that. With perfect capital mobility, it's the financial markets that dominate the balance of payments effects. Okay, so In other words, this is going to result in a private capital account surplus. The financial account balance will be in surplus because of this assumption. So what we have is pressure for an appreciation. The high demand for our bonds means that foreigners have to buy our currency in order to complete the transaction. This puts pressure for an appreciation. What you then have is that the central bank, with fixed exchange rates, and that's the example we're using, with fixed exchange rates, the central bank will intervene, and let me actually so we have excess demand for domestic currency in the foreign exchange market. Central bank turns around and buys up foreign exchange and pushes out domestic currency into the foreign exchange market to satisfy this excess demand. So what you have is an increase in foreign exchange reserves as the central bank prevents the exchange rate from appreciating. You have to get domestic currency out into the foreign exchange market to prevent the appreciation from occurring. The increase in domestic currency in circulation tends to raise the domestic money supply. Not through an open market operation in the domestic market by buying and selling bonds or by printing money, but instead by the intervention in the foreign exchange market. The increase in the money supply will tend to have an increase in aggregate demand because interest rates will fall from where they had been. You'll have more economic activity. So what you have is that in the fixed exchange rate, the tax cut or government spending, the fiscal policy, the effect of that is given an extra boost by the intervention in the foreign exchange market and the subsequent increase in the money supply. Now, what that means is that in the fixed exchange rate world, fiscal policy tends to be effective at raising nominal GDP. Now, that's in contrast to monetary policy, which we saw was very ineffective. So if you've got fixed exchange rates, fiscal policy tends to be the way to change aggregate demand in the short run. Okay. Now, again, a critical part of this is the high degree of capital mobility that we're assuming in this scenario. Okay, so that's Keynesian open economy, fiscal policy with fixed exchange rates.